Welcome to Food Production with Container Gardens and Wicking Beds. This is a presentation developed for the Mother Earth News Fair, Belton, Texas, 2020. Um, Even though today's presentation is titled Wicking Beds and Container Gardening, we're only going to talk about wicking beds a little bit here. We're really focusing on container gardening because all wicking beds are container gardens, but not all container gardens are wicking beds. So let's start out from there. So it will also start out with, well, what is a container garden? What does that mean? It just means growing plants in any type of a container, which can run from very large to small, deep to shallow. It doesn't really matter if you really think about it. Even raised beds are a type of container. We basically build a box and fill it up with a soil mix. But for today's presentation, when I say container garden, I'm talking about any type of container that isolates the soil that the plants are growing in from the earth itself. Which brings us right over into thinking about wicking beds. If we have a container that does that, the majority of the time, not all of the time, but the majority of the time, whatever we're using to do that with is going to be something that is going to be watertight or very easily can at least be made watertight up to a given level where we want to bring water to. So wicking beds are just a form of container gardening where water stored in the bottom of the container and allowed to wick up from the bottom. This could be manual, where we add water as we need it. It can be automated, where either we run it by timers or a float valve plumbed to a system that has constant pressure. And they can be static or flow through. So a static bed is what most of them are, but we can actually set a wicking bed so the water level comes up to a given point. We have a stand-up overflow pipe, and it overflows back into a reservoir with continuously running water. The nice thing about that is we maintain that level, but we can tie it into a larger scale system like an aquaponics system. Many of my wicking beds are actually tied into aquaponics systems, so they're aquaponics, but they're grown in soil. So there's a lot of different ways we can do this. The key here is we're reducing maintenance, and I think we should always consider when we're doing container gardening, if it will work, doing a wicking bed. And there's a bunch of ways to do it, and I had to make a decision with the time I had in this presentation exactly what to cover. And I felt that it would be more advantageous to talk about what to plant, how to do the fertility, etc., than try to explain how to put a wicking bed together when there's a million YouTube videos out there that show how to do it. So here's the basics of it. You use something to create a reservoir in the bottom. You use something that creates a wicking medium between that water and the soil that you're growing in, and you put in some sort of a divider. I like to use weed blocker fabric. I actually generally put weed blocker fabric over my pipes. Then I put in medium sand in this instance. I use lava rock a lot too. Then once you get that level done, put in another layer of weed block, and I like to bring my weed blocker up the side. So I put more weed blocker in than I need, and that weed blocker itself helps to wick fluid up into the soil mix. And then we plant into the soil and we mulch. And whether we're doing a wicking bed or we're doing container gardens, they're all container gardens. Just some are wicking and some are not. So let's go back to just containers as a whole here. This includes wicking beds and straight container gardens. The big advantage is, why would you want to do this? Number one, you control everything. Because there is an isolation between Mother Earth and what you're doing. Everything that goes in that container is completely under your control. You can custom mix anything. If you want to grow something that likes acidic environments, we can mix up an acid mix to grow blueberries, even in a place like I live where, my soil is so alkaline that, you might as well call it the alkaline flats. We can grow stuff anywhere. Live in the desert, the best thing you can do is probably grow in a container because it's much more easy to control your water usage, which is going to be your biggest challenge. And it conserves the water and the nutrient. Easy to work on and maintain. The older I get, the less I want to bend over. I try to do some bending over for exercise, but repetitive motion, long term, dealing with, being down on your knees, pulling weeds and stuff, when you can have your garden right at your waist level or even a little higher, so much easier to work on. Smaller containers can be moved, and even relatively large containers can be moved with something like a dolly or a hand truck. And we can do succession and layered planting in containers. Now, we can actually do that anywhere. We can certainly do that in an in-the-ground garden, but if we leave that out, we lose some of the magic about how much we can produce out of a relatively small area using containers. And containers do all of this, and they still require less maintenance, they in general keep plants stress-free because we've isolated out and we're able to control what they're growing in, and we're able to keep the moisture level right where we want it. And they tend to reduce or contain disease. A lot of people think that disease is worse with container gardening because we have a smaller confined area. Well, if we get a disease in a plant, we have that problem whether it's in the ground or not. But if we have a big garden and we get a disease in one of our plants and it's traveling through the exudates in the soil system, it can go systemic, where if we have it in an individual container, we can isolate the problem to just that container. Basically, we have a way to do some triage and some isolation. There are some disadvantages, though. I'm big on, if I'm going to tell you something's great, I'm going to tell you the downside, too. And there's nothing out in the world that has advantages that doesn't have a counterbalancing disadvantage. Number one, initially it's more expensive. There's no doubt it's less expensive. Just dig up some ground and plant into it. You have to pay for the container. You have to pay for the fill. You might have other materials if you're doing wicking beds like piping or bulkheads. So there's more initial expense. There is a limit to the size of plants, and some plants just don't like being in them. I've had some really big containers and planted things like okra, and it just doesn't like it. It's just like, nope, I don't like this. I don't like being contained. And it's corn. I found that even if you use dwarf varieties of corn, they tend to fall over. They don't tend to grow as healthily as they do in the ground. Some containers will break down over time and then end up being a garbage item. And it's something we have to deal with, either recycling or going to a landfill. So we need to really think about that. That's not necessarily a disadvantage unless we don't think about it. I like to use containers with very long life cycles. If we're not doing a wicking bed, they can dry out really quickly and there's no recourse for the plant. Once you've dried all the way to the bottom, you're dry and you have dead plants. So we have to think about that. And they can be more subject to heat and cold. There's a lot of things we can do that actually turn that and flip that around where it makes it easier for us to control the root temperature. But on rapid temperature swings, it can be a problem as well. Before we get into what we grow, let's talk about my core fertility program. I've been doing this one way or another in containers. I've been doing it even with some of my aquaponics systems. Some components of this go into it. Definitely with my in-ground gardens for about 15 years that I've developed this. And I'm not going to say I don't do anything else. I'm going to say this is the core. And if you do this, about 90% of the problems related to fertility that gardeners have will go away and you won't have to deal with them. Number one, you want an organic, balanced fertilizer. So if you look, my particular one of choice is called Dr. Earth Premium Gold, and it's a 4-4-4. That's the NPK ratio. And I like that it is balanced. That means I know I'm getting equal amounts, and I don't care if it's 4, 5, 5 or something like that. I'm not big on a core fertilizer. Now, you might need a nitrogen boost. You can use blood meal, and it's almost all nitrogen. That's fine. But for your core fertility, if you have something that's balanced, you know you're not going to be out of whack with potassium and phosphorus. So if you see something that's like 19-1-1, generally not the type of thing I would use for my core fertilizer. And with the Dr. Earth product, it has an awful lot of beneficial microorganisms in the form of colony-forming bacteria and fungi. And so it kind of does double duty for you on that. A foliar feed and compost tea. You can make your own. I like convenience, and the Garrett Juice Plus product is my product of choice. It's available all around Texas where this presentation is being given. It's available in most of the country now through Medina, and additionally, it is available through sources like Amazon. I use that multiple times a year. Initially, when I set up a bed, in addition to the Dr. Earth and other organic material, I always do a good soil drench with it. I usually do a soil drench with it right after I plant my first big crop of the year. And then several times during the year, I will mix up a foliar mix and spray with a simple 2-gallon, $9 plastic sprayer. I'll spray the plants with it. In the evening is when I like to do that. A natural mineral supplement. There's a whole bunch of secondary nutrients, macro minerals that are needed, and kelp has just about everything. Very small amounts of a lot of it, but most of the plants only need very small amounts of it. And I generally use my kelp mixed with the same spray that I'm doing the Garrett Juice Plus. So I combine those two, really, really easy. Fungal inoculation with the Dr. Earth product in the other premium fertilizers they offer, and some other manufacturers do well as well. There's already some fungal bacterial stuff in there, but I like to use a mycorrhizal fungal inoculant at least once a year, or I'll even do something like using King Strophoria mushroom spawn under my mulch, something that builds the fungal population up high. When it comes to your minerals, the four that have the most likely deficiency for most gardens: iron and zinc, calcium and magnesium. And if you have plants that just seem to be developing chlorosis, where they lose color in the leaves, they just don't look happy, and it looks like anything other than a disease, you probably have a deficiency in one of these four minerals. And here's the thing, they're like super twins. If you have a deficiency in iron, you can't get to the zinc either. And if you have a deficiency in calcium, you can't get to the magnesium. If you have a deficiency in magnesium, you can't get to the calcium. So most of the chelated mineral forms of these minerals are available in a liquid, and you add it to a watering can. You can fold your feed or soak it, and it's immediately available to the plant. And they usually come in pairs: iron, zinc, calcium, magnesium. In those pairs, and there's a reason. And if it doesn't come with it, don't do it. And you want a chelated mineral that's immediately available to the plant. Then compost and mulch, repeat. Compost and mulch, repeat. And it probably would have said that 4 times, except it wouldn't have fit in the bullet point on the slide. Like, I add compost and mulch constantly throughout the season to my wicking beds and my container gardens. And then have a schedule and follow it. Have a time that you're going to fertilize. You know, it's great you fertilize when you put stuff out, but have at least once or twice a year that you fertilize, depending on what you're growing, and have that marked on a calendar. Same with your foliar feed, your mineral supplementation, etc. Put it on a calendar and follow it. And then if it's not enough, you can always increase it. But I find if you don't have a schedule, we put things off, especially when in the middle of summer, when it's hot and we don't feel like it, the kids are out of school, we're busy, and that is when the plants are the most stressed, and they're going to need that interim feeding the most. Soil mix for your container beds. This is what I do. Don't overthink it. Make it simple, and this works really good if you're doing a straight-up container garden or if you're doing a wicking bed. Your fundamental base: compost and perlite. Do not buy the tiny little bags of perlite for $9.50 for a little quart of it at Walmart or what have you. Go to your feed stores or your garden stores, something like that. You can buy a giant bag of perlite, huge bag of perlite, for about like 14, 15 bucks. It's incredibly inexpensive. And I'll mix that at about 15% to the volume of compost. That's my main mix, and it's simple. Then I want to add some sort of fluffy organic matter. For me, I have a lot of live oak trees. I just run over a bunch of oak leaves with the lawnmower, rake it up, and throw it in there till it feels right. Another thing that I use in most of my beds, but not all of my beds, is expanded shale. It's shale that's been heated up and puffed, kind of like the perlite, and I'll add that about 5% of the mix. But again, it's something I'll add just based on the feel and the look of it. I get it for $90 a yard, so a yard goes a long way. And then you want a top layer cap, and that can just be straight compost, or that can be a organic gardening product. Miracle Grow makes one. I can't something gold or something like that now. It comes in a black and yellow, but it's really a gold-looking product. And the name of it escapes me right now. That's a really great product for capping. I know some people hate Miracle Grow because, well, it's Miracle Grow and it's really to Scotts and Monsanto Bear and all. I believe in the free market. I believe when we patronize companies that make a good, environmentally friendly product, they make more of those. And that happens to be a good product. So any good garden soil organic product as a top layer. But the main reason we want to put a cap on there is things like perlite float, and it's annoying, and it kind of ruins the dispersal. If we put a cap on it, it stops that from happening, and it's less annoying, and it works better. Then worms and critters. So I get my critters because I throw leaves in there and things like that. I don't worry. They're like, oh, you got roly-polies or earwigs or something. I don't worry about it. The bad critters are going to get in there. Good critters keep them away. And worms, I will buy worms and add them to my containers, add them to my gardens, whatever, if I don't have them already. Here's my big thing. When you get that set up, mulch, mulch, and more mulch. If you look at the slide here, the soil mix that I'm holding in my hand is exactly what I just described. You see a great deal of wood mulch on top of it. If it's wood mulch, it's straw mulch, I don't care, but mulch, mulch, and mulch. Good thick layer, at least a couple inches. That's going to keep your moisture from, your soil from drying out and losing its moisture. It's going to pull in some moisture if you get a little bit too wet, and it's going to release it through osmosis if the soil gets a little bit dry. No clay, no topsoil. If you're doing an in-ground garden, you have clay, you have clay. If you're buying topsoil for an in-ground garden to help build it up, fine. Topsoil and clay are heavy. They don't belong in containers. And if you're in a pinch, any really good organic potting soil, you can just fill it up with that. It just gets expensive. This is kind of the meat of the presentation here. This is the important stuff. I do what's called a layered and successional approach, meaning that I'm going to harvest stuff through my gardening cycle all the way through. I grow almost 12 months out of the year, really about 10. Things do kind of get really dialed down in January and February, and they go right back up. And if you look here, this is one of those things where somebody looked at this. Is a 50-gallon Rubbermaid tub. And almost all the pictures here are going to show you 50-gallon Rubbermaid tubs because I have a system that was designed to work with aquaponics and a flow-through style, and that's what I have. Probably the best product, though, for you to use for your containers for bang for the buck are IBC containers. Cut in half, you get 2 per. I just saw them being advertised for $25 a piece at a local Craigslist advertisement in my area. That means you get 2 of them for $12.50 a piece for a great big container, and they make great wicking beds as well. Again, I'm using 100-gallon Rubbermaid tubs here. These will last forever. That's the big thing here. But if you look at this, there's more planted here than most people would think makes sense. There's 2 tomato plants in the back. There's pepper plants and some basil in the foreground. There's some lettuces. There's nasturtium. There's some spinach. There's some chard. There's definitely some red amaranth in this one. And there's no way all of this can grow in and everything can be healthy, or at least that's what you would think. Because this is what my container gardens look like in early to mid-spring when everything really starts to grow in. You can see the nasturtiums have blown up. There's red amaranth strewn throughout there. There's pep. Now, the peppers in this situation here, they're already a couple foot tall. One thing to consider, all of these beds are elevated because they were part of this aquaponics flow-through system. All of these containers have now been relocated to the ground inside this structure that you're seeing is an aviary that I've grown quail and other poultry in. And it's still integrated that way. It's just this much more space conscious now that they're gone to the ground. But this is looking from the other direction. And again, if you look at this, you're like, this doesn't make any sense. How are the peppers that are buried in all that going to bear fruit and ripen? How's that pepper plant not going to just be consumed by all the rest of this growth? I mean, it looks cool, but can it be productive? It can, because it's not only layered, it's successional. Meaning that I know my climate and I know what grows when in my climate. And at this point, we're in the late spring. And look what's starting to happen. Look at the nasturtiums, which are the big green leaves with the red flowers in the foreground. You see the yellow leaves starting to form toward the bottom of them right there? These plants right now are hitting a point with our temperatures and our heat in our Texas north central climate where they're ready to quit. They're ready to be done. They're only a few weeks at this point from they're just basically all going to die back. And at this point, I've been able to harvest them for flowers and for greens over and over and over again. You'll see that the red amaranth is really tall in this plant here, a little bit shorter here. We've harvested these as greens, and whatever's left pretty soon, whatever I can't eat and it's too big to use as a green, I'm going to cut it, pull it out of there, and I'm going to give it to my ducks. And it's going to feed the ducks. The dill, so if you look right here in the front, you see the dill. It's starting to look kind of frazzled at the bottom. It's about to go too. So we're about to success this over into peppers. And, you wonder, can a pepper do well in this situation? And you can see at this point, there's still some nasturtiums. And at this point, the nasturtiums that are hanging on are the ones that are in the shade of the pepper versus the other way around. But that's a Cubanelle pepper. And I've seen a lot of people grow a lot of Cubanelle peppers, but I grow these Cubanelle peppers in these systems, and they're about as big as a dadgum Marconi pepper. I've never seen Cubanelles bigger than the ones that we grow in these systems. So the spatial issue is not a problem once we get to here. And if you notice, if you look to the left of my pinky there, that's a tomato. So we have tomato in this system as well. We still have the nasturtiums, and there's some other things going on. This approach works because eventually some of these plants just give up the ghost because they can't handle our heat, and they move on. And that's how the whole system works. This is kind of an example of what a spring harvest looks like for me. You know, we've got broccoli there. That's the red amaranth that you've seen already in quite a few of the pictures. And again, we use that as a green. Up till about the size it is in this bundle, it's fine as a green. Once it gets bigger than that, it's really not very good as a green. We've got some parsley in there, 2 different kinds. There's some spinach and chard in there, some garlic chives. This is an everyday occurrence all through the spring, but eventually almost everything you're looking at in this picture, except for the chard, it goes away. And it's designed to go away. That's the plan. The entire plan is for these plants to occupy space while the plants that are more long-term annuals in these systems are growing up. And by the time they're ready to take over, these guys go away on their own accord because they're just out of time for the climate. And what that lets us do is if we take a container like a 100-gallon Rubbermaid and I just grew 4 pepper plants in it, you'd say, what a waste. But if I can produce food out of it 10 months out of the year with a continuous flow, and as these plants go out, even with the peppers, we're going to bring in some other things that continue to give us harvest, all of a sudden you're like, how do you get so much food out of an area that really is about 4 to 6 square feet, somewhere in between there, depending on how you do the math on it. Well, we do this by planning everything and knowing the order in which to plant. And understanding that some of these plants can make it through the seasons, but what we're going to do is we're going to harvest them down and grow smaller leaves. So this is Swiss chard, and this is one of the greens I can grow almost year-round here. In fact, it overwinters just fine. It just slows, like this time of year in the winter, it just doesn't grow very fast. But when it takes off in the spring, this is the kind of production that we get off of it. Now, if that's in a container with a bunch of other plants, it's going to take up a lot of space. But we'll go ahead and harvest it, and we'll consume it like crazy until until our longer term annuals kind of take over the space, and then we get these smaller yields off of it throughout the rest of the year. But I really like this plant because we get both a green yield and we get the stems, and the stems are fantastic. And the way we cook with this plant is we'll take those green leaves and we'll trim them off the stems, and we'll cut the stems up like chunks of celery. We cook the stems first and then do the greens at the end, or use the greens in a salad. Either way, it's like getting 2 yields for the price of 1. Next is arugula. This is another one of the greens that I am able to grow mostly throughout the year, though it does get a bit bitter in the summer. But arugula, I'm going to grow that through the winter and into the spring. And even when I harvest everything back and the nasturtiums and the dill and everything else kind of goes away for the year, we'll have that understory of arugula. So we have between the chard and the arugula, we have this almost perennial source of greens. And without those, this wouldn't work really well. As we're in the spring, this is where we can use crops like broccoli. Now, when I was a kid in Pennsylvania, we had a big old 1/4 acre in-ground garden for our family, for a subsistence garden. We grew 1 row of broccoli every year. 18 plants down one half of a row, the other half was cauliflower. And when they got like the head is right here, I'd go down with a bucket for my grandma and I'd harvest it. And we'd eat as much of it as we could before it started to go bad. And when it was getting to the point where it started to get looser in the head and whatever, she would can it or freeze it. And then every week, like clockwork, I would take a bucket back down into the garden and I'd cut the side shoots off, and it would go all the way to August in Pennsylvania. We would get a bucket of broccoli, about 2 to 3 meals for a big family a week, every week from those 18 plants. So when I moved to Texas, I'm like, I'll grow broccoli because I like broccoli. I don't care what George Bush says, right? I like broccoli. And it doesn't work that way here. It goes away, so we let it go away. We will generally get whatever plants we put out in the spring. We'll get these beautiful heads of broccoli, even in container gardens. We may use some of the leaves a bit like kale. You can eat the leaves of broccoli. I just don't think they're that great. And we might get one harvest of secondary shoots from all the plants, another meal. And then we just cut them off at the base. And I throw it in the compost, and the chickens and the ducks eat what they want, and the rest of it becomes fertility for the next crop. And when that huge, I mean, think about how big a broccoli plant is compared to the head. When that space comes out, those other plants are just able to fill in and take over. Another plant that we grow, just mentioned it, kale. We grow kale in the spring. And this is Lanacino or dinosaur kale, and I've grown this to where it looks like a tree. But it eventually just really isn't worth having anymore. So I've gone now to where we grow our kale. We start our kale in the fall, and we grow kale through the fall, into the winter, into the spring. And about the time, if you look in this particular bed, we've got some tomatillos in the back. They're getting up about 2 foot tall off the top of that bed. About there is where we'll take our last harvest of the kale, and all that space opens up, and all of those other plants, like the peppers and beans and other plants that are in there, they come in and they occupy that space. And that way we have continued to keep something growing in there throughout most of the year. Next, red amaranth. This has become one of my go-to spring greens. I love this. It looks beautiful when you cook with it. It looks beautiful in salads. And in this particular case, I had a bed that I wasn't really ready to plant yet, so I just carpet bombed it with red amaranth. And about the size it is right now is the perfect size to harvest the whole plant and cook it in a saute, like a substitute for spinach. You can see there's some nasturtium and some radish in there and some other things, but that's primarily all I'm really doing with this particular bed is growing a root mat. And every time I seed this plant, I'm growing a root mat. And what I do with this, not in this picture, but in most instances, whichever end of that bed is pointing south, that's where I plant this. I plant this, and once it gets to a certain height, I harvest it, and I give it to the compost and the ducks. And I take as much of it as I can as feed along the way for us. And maybe in a few places, I'll let a few of them grow great, big, huge, and they produce seed, and it's enough seed for the next season. 2 of these plants will produce you enough seed, you won't ever have to buy seed ever again. I used to grow a variety called Red Hopi Red Dye. And this is red garnet, and I found this to just be more reliable, more productive. It reseeds itself more readily, and it holds its red color longer and later into the year. So I've kind of standardized on it. Next up, dill. This is another, I do not buy little bitty packets of dill. I buy a great big giant bag of dill seed, and I seed this with the amaranth. And in this instance, you can see that front side of the bed is facing south. I want this toward the front side of the bed. And the amaranth and the dill, I seed those. And man, the 2 of them, along with the nasturtium, just make a great morning salad. We walk around. I want you to think hunter-gatherer. So instead of thinking from the standpoint of like a trophy hunter with a garden where we're trying to grow 400 pounds of beans and, a half-acre corn or something like that, what we're doing is we're growing this ability to constantly harvest something a little at a time every day as we walk through, like a hunter-gatherer on our own property. And the dill is just a wonderful tasting herb with everything, but it also stores well. So when it gets to the point where I start to see the edges get a little bit yellow and all, I know it's not going to last much longer, I cut out all of this wonderful dill, I hang it up and I dry it, and I have a dried herb for the rest of the year. And again, it opens that space and it lets things fall in. Now, what I'm trying to do is kind of take you through by season. So everything that I've shown you up to now is the stuff that we're growing in the spring that eventually goes away or goes into more of an understory, lower level of production like the chard and the arugula. We're moving now into our main summer production, sweet potato. Right where I plant that amaranth, right where I plant those nasturtiums, right where I plant that dill up in the front, I put slips of sweet potato, and specifically I grow purple Japanese sweet potatoes in the front of those beds. And then I train those vines out the front of those beds. This one's in a kind of a little bit of a different system on a pond, but it just gives you an idea how much production you get off of these guys. It's huge, massive production. But by training the vine to spill over the side of the bed to the south side where it gets the sun, it doesn't take up hardly any space in the bed. It will eventually form tubers, down deep below the roots of your peppers, tomatoes, etc. And that's like free food. Oh, by the way, guess what? You can eat the greens. This is my go-to summer green. Once all these wonderful greens from spring are gone and they're not coming back till fall, this is our main substitute for spinach. We saute this, cook this in pans all the time. The stems are not worth trying to heat. They are kind of woody and thick and not worth it, but and you can't over harvest it. Once it gets established like you see here, you go out and cut off 2 or 3 long vines, strip the leaves off of them, and it's more than you need for dinner. And I put them in almost every single container because it doesn't, again, you do have to pay a little bit of mind to them. You might start to see runners going back through your containers and they will crawl up and take over your peppers and all. But once a week, go out and prune that stuff off. And if you need more, every time you prune them off, stick them in some water in the shade, root them, and pop them in somewhere else. So I might only start out with 4 or 5 slips at the beginning of the year. I'll set up 1 potato that's left over from the year before, and I'll make slips from it. But once that gets established, I just spread this stuff all over the place. And again, since we keep ducks and chickens, anything that we can't eat, and if there's too much vine, we just feed it to them. And the ducks love this stuff. And then what happens? At the end of the season, when the frost finally comes and the peppers are done, etc., we just have the tubers. And what we'll get is somewhere between 4 to 6 tubers per container. So if we have, let's say, 10 containers, we're talking about like 40 to 60 sweet potatoes that are like free food. They're just show up. There's no effort in them whatsoever. That's gardening smart. Nasturtiums. Nasturtiums are another crop that I love. And with my fertility program, this is what we get when it comes to nasturtiums. I mean, they're like vegetable wraps. And that's one of the ways that we use them. They have a really hot, spicy kind of bite to them. But unlike, let's say, a hot capsaicin, a hot pepper, they don't have a persistent burn. Where if you eat a jalapeno or a serrano, if you're really stupid, a scorpion or something like that pepper, you're on fire for it. It seems like days, but it's hours. Nasturtiums have that pungent, bam, they pop you, and in a couple seconds, they're gone. Kind of like horseradish. And it just opens up so many things you can do culinarily with them. And they're another one that kind of fades out. They hang on a little bit longer for me than dill and amaranth. But eventually, they kind of go away. Sometimes I'll have a few that find little pockets they're happy with and they stay long term. I'm happy to have that. But all this mass eventually moves out of the way so that we can keep growing. And my main crop, I've been called the pepper whisperer, is peppers. That's a jalapeno. And that isn't a special jumbo, mondo, super gigante jalapeno hybrid. That's a jalapeno M. Just your standard old-fashioned heirloom jalapeno. And if you look, you can see in the background, you see some red from the amaranth still hanging on. Those peppers were grown that crowded out with all those other plants. And I actually think it helps them do better. And what they do is they grow very, very aggressively. And one thing you do have to do is if they're getting a little leggy, if they grow a little bit too fast up, prune them off a little bit at the top until your competing plants, again, atrophy out through the year. But when you do that, you end up with a very robust pepper bush. The important thing to understand about peppers is they're not really an annual. Peppers are a perennial. If you dig a few up every year and put them in containers, you can bring them in the house, overwinter them, and start out with great big plants early in the year. I've done it a few times and it works. But I have such great results, it's really not needed. This is what my peppers look like. By about mid-May, I'm starting to harvest this. And we'll harvest jalapenos enough to 3 or 4 times a week, all the way until Thanksgiving. We're wrapping peppers in bacon and putting them on the grill a couple times a week, at least. I have peppers, jalapeno peppers, from when I lived in Arkansas. We moved from our Arkansas place 7 years ago. And I still have some dehydrated jalapeno peppers. I don't dehydrate them anymore. I've got peppers for years, literally, just from growing like this. And I don't grow that many. I grow 12 jalapeno plants a year. And it's more than I can eat and more than I can give away. And it's this layered approach that allows for that. Because again, if with my 100-gallon containers, if I was using 3 containers to grow 12 pepper plants, it would seem so wasteful and out of place. But with all of this other production stacked in it, it just works out great. Here's another one. So I want you to start thinking like, when you grow in the food forest, and we have that 7-layer system, the canopy and the subcanopy and the understory and the herbaceous layer and the rhizomial layer. This is called Chinese artichoke. It's also known as cronensis, and they look like some kind of weird little worms or something when you put them in a bowl. It freaks people out, like Klingons are coming for dinner or something. But this is a great tuber crop. It grows in a very sprawling habitat. It looks a lot like a spearmint or another kind of a mint, but it doesn't have a mint flavor. I don't think there's any use for the vegetation part, but it doesn't need a lot of sun. So I plant this in the mid-story. So I've got my, heading into summer, I've got my sweet potatoes planted in the north side of the container. I've got these planted in the middle of the container. And as the peppers get bigger, I'll go ahead and prune out a little bit of the understory of the peppers. So maybe about 6 inches up, I'll prune all the leaves off the peppers. Now that's when they're about 2 foot tall, when it's not going to bother them at all, when those leaves are not going to be doing real well anyway. That lets airflow through. And in that space, I just leave these artichokes, beyond whatever I use every year, just leave them in there. And they come back on their own. You can't get rid of them once you plant them. Be sure you want them where you put them. And they fill that mid-story, and they act as a living mulch. But then they're another yield. So now I'm moving into summer. I've already gotten all of this bounty from all of the mostly greens and herbs and stuff like that. But now I'm growing peppers, I'm growing Chinese artichokes, and I'm growing sweet potatoes. But 2 of the crops are pretty much just set it and forget it and take what you want as you need it. Next, groundnuts. Now, if you stick groundnut into something like Google, you'll find a lot of descriptions of something called a peanut, as we call them here in the United States. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a plant called Apius americana. These are a tuber, and they grow very much in a vining format. I plant them on the north end of that container, where my tomatoes or my peppers are. And I trellis them up the back side. They're going to, again, produce a rhizome or a root yield for me. But instead of trellising them over, they like to climb. So I'll give them some sort of support, and they can go up the back. Now, they're not shading anything out because they're in the back. So now I've got this great vine crop, which, by the way, also fixes nitrogen. Growing this, it's an annual, but it's really a perennial because it overwinters in the soil. I don't have to pull it out. It'll produce over and over and over and over again. It's a high yield production. They don't grow very deep. When you harvest these, you just barely stick your hands underneath the top, the layer of mulch, and you'll feel them and you can pull them out. And as long as you don't harvest all of them, they come back. And they're not going to reproduce based on the size that they are because they just keep growing. They're not like a potato where they get to a certain size and they stop and they turn into a seed. They just keep getting bigger and bigger till they reach whatever potential they have. Now, that is genetic, and the variety I'm growing is called Nutty Groundnut. It was developed by LSU University, and they get as big as a small potato. For people like me that like to be low carb, they're a good source of inulin and what's called indigestible fiber, or actually, I can't remember the word for it now. There's another word for it. It was a type of pre-soluble or something like that. They're a fiber that does not affect the sugar in your blood because it can only be digested in the lower intestine. It's very good for you. It has anti-cancer properties, and it actually lowers blood sugar. So the small amount of carbohydrate that it does provide, it is more than offset, and it actually reduces blood sugar from other carbohydrate intake. Very good product for diabetics to consume. So you can eat about 6 ounces of this, and you basically have the same carbohydrate yield as like 2 ounces of potato if you want to keep that down. And it's a free food, basically. You never have to buy it more than once. It takes about a year or 2 to get enough tubers to where you can sustainably harvest, but once you get there, you just have it forever. The one thing it doesn't like is to get dry. So wicking beds and then growing in the understory of your taller plants like peppers and tomatoes, and then trellising the vine itself up. It loves sun, but it wants the roots to stay moist. One of the great crops and native to the United States. Tomatoes. I've had a love-hate relationship with tomatoes since I moved to Texas. I grew up in Pennsylvania in just fertile farm country. You could pretty much throw a tomato on the ground and come back in 6 weeks and there was a plant, and in 12 weeks there were tomatoes to harvest. And I got here and I thought, I'll grow all the tomatoes and blah, blah, blah. And blight has kicked my butt so many ways from Sunday. What I've done is I've gone to growing cherry tomatoes almost exclusively. I grow a bunch of different varieties of cherry tomatoes. This happens to be called Sweet 100. It is one of my favorite cherry tomatoes to grow. Another example is black cherry. These are my two go-tos, but I grow a bunch of other ones. And what I do every year is I plant them to the backside of my containers. I trellis them up, and I harvest, and I harvest, and I harvest, and I harvest. And about mid to late June, early July, I'll start to see blight show up. And I've tried all of Howard Garrett's tricks. I've tried all of my own tricks. It's not a fertility issue. It's just, it is a difficult thing to grow tomatoes for a full season in Texas. But if you grow cherry tomatoes, you don't get cracked fruit, you don't have problem with blossom end rot, and you get massive, massive production. About the time that I'm starting to see blight really become a problem, I will have massive clusters of fruit that's not ripe, that's still green. And I'll cut those entire clusters of fruit off, and I just sit them into the containers. I don't plant them, I don't stick them in the ground, I just set them on the surface of the containers, and I prune out all the vines. Then the peppers go crazy because they have all the space to themselves. And then I harvest peppers all the way to Thanksgiving, and over time, all those clusters of tomatoes just ripen. I don't put them inside. When I was in Pennsylvania as a kid, we would take the green tomatoes and put them on top of the refrigerator out in the shed, and it was a warm area with sun. I just set the whole clusters on top of the beds, and eventually they all ripen. And then whatever I have beyond what we can use as they're harvested, we save, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Herbs. My two number one herbs to grow in these systems are basil and thyme, and they grow right through the big part of the season for me. I'll plant them right in. So what I'll do with that is I'll start my basil and thyme plants indoors, and about the time that the nasturtiums, the amaranth, all of that stuff is starting to kind of go away, I'll just set those plants right in between the peppers and the herbs. They grow, or the peppers and tomatoes, they grow right up in there, and I'll have those for the full duration of the season. And there's the old saying, if it grows together, it goes together. And tomatoes and basil in particular are just fantastic together. So we do a lot of bruschetta and things like that. And thyme is just one of my go-to herbs for cooking in general. And that'll actually get to a point where it doesn't really go away, but I've kind of had enough of dealing with it because it's so trailing and it's taking up space. And I'll just cut a bunch of it out and I'll dry it, and I'll have, a dried herb out of that as well. Some rules here, though, to make this all work. Harvest, harvest, harvest. Gardeners tend to like, oh, if I harvest all that, it'll be gone. I want to make sure I keep it, And the more you harvest, the more production you'll get. The number one way to get more peppers is to harvest peppers. The number one way to get more tomatoes is harvest tomatoes. If the plant's sitting there with a lot of fruit on it, I'm good. I've reproduced. The world is great. I'm happy. You take the fruit off of it, and it's like, oh, I got to make another generation so it blossoms again. These are peppers where I've gotten to the point where I can't keep up. If you look, a lot of these jalapenos, and one of the things I love about growing my own jalapenos is red jalapenos. You just don't find them in the store. There's some other peppers in there too. There's some Cubanelles and some New Mexico chilies and stuff like that. But most of that's jalapenos. And you can see it's starting to crack. They get a little wrinkled. This is where I just can't harvest fast enough. And I still try to harvest as much as I can. And the more you harvest, the healthier your plants will be. And this is greens too, man. You cut greens, they grow back. That type of thing. Harvest, harvest, harvest. Next, be your own chef. Have some fun. This is a typical morning for me when I'm walking around checking on my gardens. And it's container garden stuff, and it's wild forage as well. But I've got some nasturtium leaf and some spinach leaves at the bottom there. And then I've got some parsley, some lamb's quarters, pea tendrils. I didn't talk about peas in the presentation. I grow peas every year as well. And when the peas start growing out, you just pick the tendrils off them even before they're producing peas. That's what the microgreen guys are growing, but you can pick them off large plants. There's some amaranth in there. There's some locust blossoms, some wild garlic blossom, etc. And I took people when I put that on Facebook. People were like, "Yeah, I don't know why you waste your time trying to make things look pretty. It looks like something you'd get in a yuppie restaurant from a chef or something." And you'd pay probably two of those on a plate as an appetizer would be $10. It takes about 5 minutes to put that together. The garlic chives, etc. Have fun with this, guys. Really spoil yourself. I mean, think about eating like this while you're walking around checking your garden in the morning before you go to work. You'll have a better day at work. Next, grow what you eat what you grow, store what you eat. In the prepper world, we say eat what you store and store what you eat. Well, when you start gardening, think about that as well. If you're growing a whole bunch of something, but you don't really like to eat it, well, if you can't use it or sell it, you've got a surplus you can't use. And if it doesn't go to your animals, you really have a problem. And if it's something you can grow more of than you can use, then have a plan to store it. This is what I was talking about with the tomatoes. This is part of my last harvest of mixed cherry tomatoes for the year. This came in late July last year. And this was all of the ones that were green that I cut the clusters off of, and it ain't half of it. Me and a friend and my grandson, the harvest before this, spent a couple hours just cutting cherry tomatoes in half and putting them in our Excalibur dehydrator. I ended up with something like 7-quart jars full of dehydrated cherry tomatoes. If you've ever dehydrated cherry tomatoes, you know that's a lot of cherry tomatoes. And that was from about 8 plants. And I don't consider myself good at growing tomatoes because I always lose the battle with blight. But if you take the right approach, you end up still getting enough production that it really makes it worth doing in the first place. Never underestimate the power of fertility. Again, just take a look at these peppers. I've heard people say don't fertilize peppers because you don't get good production. They're always the people with sad-looking little yellow pepper plants. I've grown pepper plants. Honest to God, I've grown jalapeno pepper plants that I have pictures of myself standing next to, and they are as tall as me. I'm almost 6 foot tall. And they're so full of peppers that when it would rain, branches would fall off and self-prune from the weight of the peppers taking in all the moisture. This is because we use lots of fertility. Can you over-fertilize a pepper? I'm sure it can be done. I've read one credible account where a guy put something like 10 inches of worm castings on a field of peppers. And they were huge and he got poor yields out of them. I've never actually seen it in real life. I fertilize everything the same. I follow my schedule. This is the results that I get. There is more mythology around this than truth. Never underestimate the power of fertility. Build living systems. Just because we're container gardening doesn't mean that we have inert sterile systems. When I pull back mulch and pull up a little bit of soil, this is what I see in my gardens, and you should too. About the only problem that I have here with keeping a high worm population in some of my containers is the freaking fire ants. And we do what we can with them, but as long as I keep fire ants out of my beds are full of worms. They're full of critters. We're building living ecosystems here. We just are doing it in a container. If you want more information, of course, you can get it at my website, survivalpodcast.com. If you're at the actual event instead of watching this online, you can come get my card, see me at the booth or at the bar. We'll set something afterwards. But that's it, guys. This is not rocket science. It's not hard. It's just an understanding of the plants and the succession by which they'll grow in your individual ecosystems.